Hello everyone, today we will be doing a quick refresher on place value and see how we can apply this concept when rounding. To begin, let's look at this number right here, 7,845. So the 5 in this number would be our ones place. So we are basically starting off with 1. Think about it that way. The 4 would be our tens place right here, meaning now we're actually going by 10. So as you can see, we added a 0 that was not there originally. Let me just erase that. Our 8 would be our hundreds place. So now we actually have 2 zeros. As you can see, it's a pretty clear pattern. We're adding 1 0 as we move along the place values. And then finally, our 7 is the thousands place. Right here, so we would be adding 3 zeros. So we went from no zeros to 1 0, 2 zeros in the hundreds place. And let me just mention this. Once we reach the hundredth place, we put a comma and we move into the thousands, which we will have 3 zeros for. Obviously, beyond the thousands place, there is 10,000, 100,000s, but that would be covered in another more specific video discussing rounding, place value specifically. For today, we're just going to leave it at the thousands place, 1,000 specifically. Okay, so before we start rounding, I want to explain what it means when we say we're multiplying by 1 in the ones place, by 10 in the tens place, by 100 in the hundreds place, because that is as important when we're actually rounding and understanding how to round. So let's start with the 5. The 5 is in the ones place. Now this is the simplest place value. As the name says it, we are multiplying by 1, so 5 is just 5. There is a very different story when we talk about the following numbers, however. The 4 is in the tens place, right? So once again, as the name says it, we're multiplying by 10. That means that the 4 isn't 4, but it's 4 times 10, so 40. The 8 is in the hundreds place. So we are multiplying by 100. So 8 times 100 is 800. And don't be intimidated as the zeros increase because the rule stays the same. You're multiplying 1 times 8, which is 8, and just adding zeros, so 2 zeros. Now finally, the 7 is in the thousands place. And by now, you probably picked up the pattern that we would be multiplying by 1,000. So 7 times 1,000, right here, we would be adding 3 zeros, so 7,000. And that's the basic idea behind it, and it's very important for us to understand this when rounding. So I just wanted to go over it very briefly before we actually started with some examples. Let's say we were asked to round to the hundreds place. The first thing you have to do is identify the hundreds place, our 3. Next, what you do is you look at the neighbor or the number that came before the one you're trying to round. So that would be 5. And this is where you have to memorize 2 important rules. They're very simple to remember, but they're very important when you're rounding. If your neighbor, we're going to call the neighbor X, is greater than or equal to 5, then you have to add 1 to the number you're rounding. If your neighbor X is less than 5, then it stays the same. So you're adding nothing, plus 0. Now, applying this, let's try to solve this rounding exercise. Our neighbor is 5, and when we look at this rule, if it's greater than or equal to 5, we have to add 1 to the original number. So that means we are adding 1 to the 3, making it 4. Now what happens to this 5 and this 4? Well, the 5 we already used, so it becomes 0. And the 4, even if we didn't use it, it automatically becomes 0 as well. Any number before the one you're rounding just turn into 0 in the rounding process. Let's look at this number again, but now let's actually focus on the tens place. So we want to round to the tens place. I'm actually going to erase this so we don't get confused. So now we are rounding to the tens place. First, we have to identify what the tens place is, 5. Next, we look at the neighbor, 4. You can draw an arrow if that's helpful. I'm personally a very visual learner, so I like doing everything step by step. The 4 is less than 5, this rule right here, which means our original number, the one we're trying to round, stays the same. So the 3, because it comes after the one we're rounding, we just keep it as 3. The 5 stays the same since we're not adding, and the 4, which we used our neighbor for rounding, becomes 0. That's our final answer. Let's look at a little bit of a trickier example. First, let's round to the hundreds place. The first thing we have to do you remember? We have to look at the hundreds place, which is our 8. Then we glance at the neighbor, which is 4. And we ask ourselves, is it greater than or equal to 5, or is it less than 5? 4 is less than 5, which means the 8 stays the same. We're going to keep the 2 because it came after 8. The 8 stays the same because 4 is less than 5. The 4 becomes 0 because we already used it, and the 0 just automatically again becomes 0. Now let's look at the tens place. Let's round to the tens place. What do you have to do now? Well, I'm actually going to erase this so we don't get confused. And I believe, yes, it was an 8. My bad. There you go. So now we are going to round to the tens place. I'm identifying my tens place. I'm going to look at my neighbor. Well, 0 is less than 5, so automatically that means my 4 is going to stay the same. The 2 comes after, so it stays as 2. The 8 comes after, so it stays as 8. The 4 is going to stay as 4 because 0 is less than 5. And the 0 is just 0. Perfect. Now let's look at 55. Let's round it to the tens place. What's our tens place? Well, we have to look at this 5 right here. They're both 5s, but this one specifically is in the tens place. We are going to look at our neighbor, which is also 5. And because, remember, it has to be 5 or greater. Never forget that. A lot of people think it's just when it's greater, but when it's 5, it's also included. So when it's 5, you have to add 1 to the original number, making it 6. And because we used our neighbor already, it becomes 0. Let's do another thousands place number. First, let's look at the hundreds place. Let's identify that. That would be the 2. Now we're going to look at our neighbor. Again, our neighbor is 5, which means we have to add 1 to the original number. The 4 stays the same because it came after the 2. The 2, we're going to add 1 to make it 3. The 5, our neighbor. Oh, excuse me, I put a comma. The 5, our neighbor, is already used, so it becomes 0. And the 5 that came before it automatically becomes 0 as well. Now let's round to the tens place. So I'm actually going to make this a different color so we don't get confused. The tens place is 5 right here. So the neighbor becomes the ones place. Our neighbor is also 5, which means we are adding 1 to the original number. Now let's do this. 4 stays the same because it came after. 2 stays the same because it came after. Now we have to add 1 to this 5 right here because when we looked at the neighbor, that was also 5. So it becomes 6, and the neighbor we used becomes 0. That would be our final answer when rounded to the tens place. Okay, let's do one last one. So I'm going to erase all this. Let's round to the thousands place, which is the one we haven't done. So thousands place. If we rounded this 4 right here, let me fix that. So thousands place is our 4. We're looking at our neighbor, which is 2. 2 is less than 5, so automatically the 4 is going to stay the same. Our neighbor, the 2 which we used, becomes 0, and everything again before it just becomes 0. That would be our final answer, rounded to the thousands place. So overall, this is the basic concept of place value and how we use it when rounding. Let me know in the comments if you have any other questions or concepts you would like to review. Thank you so much.